Hello, everyone. Today we'll continue talking about Sandel's great book on justice, and we'll continue talking about chapter 5 on Immanuel Kant. So one of the important distinctions that Kant puts forth is what he calls the categorical versus hypothetical imperatives or commands. So Kant noticed that when people say things like you ought to do something, you ought to keep your promise, you ought to tell the truth, you ought to help others, and so on. When people issue those commands, many times those commands come apart. Some commands fall under the hypothetical category, and others fall under the categorical imperative category. And that's the main distinction. Let's walk through it. So first, the categorical, the hypothetical ones. Hypothetical means under the hypothesis that, or we can think of it as conditional, under the condition that. So a hypothetical or conditional imperative or command is one that has its normative force to the extent, only to the extent that the agent wants the condition to which the command is attached. In other words, there are conditional imperatives, there's a command attached to the imperative or the command, and the way in which that command applies to your actions has a claim on your behavior, binds your behavior, or it has normative force that compels you to or ought to compel you to go with one way or the other. That is attached to the condition. So articulate that way sounds very abstract, sounds very general, sounds hard to get a handle. But let me give you an example, and then it will be clear what it is that Kant is talking about. So the example is studying for the exam. Suppose you're taking my class and you come to my office hours and say, hey, I'm anxious about the exam, and I agree to give you a practice exam. And so it's an exam coming up in a week or so. And I give you a practice exam, and then I graded it and I give you a D. And I say, ooh, a D, it is passing, but it's barely passing. This is not ideal. So you ought to study for the exam. That's the command I issue. That's the command I express. You should study. You ought to study for the exam. And typically the way people speak, I just say that, I just articulate the command. But we both know that there's this condition, there's this hypothesis, there's this thing that is attached to that particular command that makes it conditional. And that's something like getting a good grade. So even though what I say is you ought to study for the exam, what I really mean and what we both know I mean is that if you want to get a good grade, then you ought to study for the exam. So it's really a conditional form. If there is this thing, there's this condition, and the condition kind of implies or requires that you do something. The command I'm issuing has normative force, has a claim on your behavior. It tells you to study. And if you don't study, you will not get a good grade. You can only get a good grade. You can only get a good grade by studying. So you ought to study if you want a good grade. But there's something peculiar. So that's a hypothetical conditional imperative. And there's something peculiar to those. It is, in this is the thing that's peculiar. It is reasonable to reply to someone issuing a command that is a conditional imperative by rejecting the condition, by foregoing the thing that it had, the thing to which the imperative is attached. And by foregoing or rejecting the condition, the normative force is no longer applicable to your actions. There's no longer a claim on your behavior. And in this particular example, what you can do is say, you know what, I don't really want a good grade. I just want a passing grade. I have other things to do with my time, and that's not really central to my career. And you tell me a story as to why it is that you think it's reasonable for you not to want a good grade. But once you tell me I don't want a good grade, the condition attached to my command, you ought to study, the reasonable response from my part is to abandon, to forego the command, to say, oh, my apologies, you don't have to. I withdraw the command. The command you ought to study presupposes that the condition to which it is attached, getting a good grade, is something you want, something you're striving to get. And if you let go of that, if you forgo that, if you abandon that condition, the command no longer applies to you. The normative force of that command is no longer binding on your behavior. It is no longer the case you ought to study for the exam. It's only the case that you ought to study for the exam if you want a good grade. And here's the way of putting it. Here's the more kind of Kantian way of putting it. Rejecting the condition suffices to undermine the normative force of conditional imperatives. If you don't want the condition to which the imperative is attached, you don't have to. It's no longer the case that you ought to do the thing that the command command says you ought to do. So those are the hypothetical or conditional imperatives. In contrast with those are the categorical imperatives, and those are different. They're still expressed by saying you ought to blank, you ought to tell the truth, and so on. But they don't have any condition attached to them. So categorical imperatives have normative force. They make a claim on your behavior. They bind your behavior in a particular way with no condition attached to them, regardless of what you want. A categorical imperative applies to your behavior, has normative force, not because you want something. It just does apply to your behavior unconditionally. And Kant says that that's because of your status as a moral agent. Categorical imperatives make a claim on your behavior simply because you're a moral agent, not because of anything you want, not because of any project you're pursuing, not because of any goal. There's nothing you can abandon such that the claim on your behavior put forth by a categorical imperative is undermined. And let me give you an example to illustrate this. So suppose you walk into class, and you wait to class, you walk next to a lake, and when you're walking by the lake, you realize there's noise, you hear some noises by the lake. So you look up and you see a baby drowning. Now you realize your predicament very quickly. You're the only one nearby. You either keep walking to your class and you make it on time, but at the expense of letting a baby drown, or you jump in and save the baby. If you jump and save the baby, your clothes are going to get wet, and you're not going to be able to make it to your class. You might get ill, you might get a cold or something. But hey, a baby's life will be saved. In that particular case, it seems that the following command is applicable. Namely, you ought to jump in and save the baby. If I were in the picture, say very far away, that I can shout that you can hear me, but not close enough that I can jump in and save the baby myself, I would say something like, hey, you ought to jump in and save the baby. Stop thinking, just jump in and save the baby, right? That's what you ought to do. Here's something very different from the example about studying. Even though here I just say, you ought to do something, jump in and save the baby. Something's different. You cannot look at me and say, oh, but no, you misunderstand. I don't really want to save babies. Oh, no, but you misunderstand. I don't really care about being a good person. Oh, you misunderstand. You cannot point to any condition to which my command, it presupposes, which is attached to my command, such that by rejecting that condition, by saying I don't want that, you will, the command will no longer be applicable to you. If you were to look at me and say, but I don't care about being a good person. I don't care about saving people. I don't care about others. That doesn't undermine the normative force in your behavior. That just makes you a bad person, right? It makes you an immoral agent. You're still responsible for your actions. If you choose to walk away and let the baby drown, you would be doing something wrong. And you have no freedom to not have the categorical imperative apply to you, the moral command apply to you. You have the freedom to violate it. You can walk away and do the wrong thing and be immoral, but it still applies to you. And the reason why you're immoral if you walk away is that you fail to comply with the normative force of the categorical imperative when it applies to you. You cannot just say, I don't want the thing to which it is attached, because there's no thing to which it is attached. That just is a command laid upon you because you're a moral agent. The fact that you can reason and you can understand that the baby's drowning, that the baby's life is valuable, and you can choose to act in accordance with your judgment that the baby's life is valuable and you ought to jump in and save the baby. Those two factors, your rationality and your freedom, ground your moral responsibility for your actions. You do not have the option to abandon or to somehow forego the command. You are in a position, in a predicament in which the command applies to you. That's your moral obligation at the moment. Your only options are to comply with it and be good, do the right thing, or to not comply with it, to violate it and do the wrong thing and be vicious. But the command, the normative force applies to you regardless of what you want. There was no condition attached to it. Just because you're a moral agent, it applies to you. So you might have heard the question, why should I be moral? Why be moral? As a deep philosophical question. And Kant thinks that that's false. It is not a deep question. It's a very superficial question. There's a very straightforward answer. Why should it be moral? Because you're a moral agent. That's what you are. You're condemned to be free, Sartre will say later on. And therefore, you condemn to be responsible for your actions. If you do something wrong, you're immoral. You're responsible for it. You're punishable, blamable, and so on. And you have to, because you're more agent. There is no escaping your freedom. There's no escaping the fact that you're responsible for your actions. You can become virtuous or vicious, but those are your options. You cannot choose to not care about morality and not be immoral. To choose to not care about morality is to choose to be immoral. There is no just abandoning, not having the moral command applied to you just because you're a moral agent. So that's a basic distinction. As I've said, the categorical imperative is the moral imperative, is what grounds morality. So let's talk about that for a little more. Kant articulates the categorical imperative, that is, provides the content of what the categorical imperative demands of you in different ways. And he thinks they're all interchangeable, that they all really amount to the same thing. But the wording sounds very different. So let's look at two famous wordings. And this is the categorical imperative, the universal law, some people call it. And it says, act only in accordance with a maxim, and I'll define that shortly, through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. So Kant's vocabulary is again vague and general, well, not vague, but it's general and obscure and peculiar to him. So it takes some time to get used to it. The basic kind of slogan is something like moral actions are universalizable. In other words, moral actions are the kinds of actions that a society would be a good society if everyone did that. So like when your mom, when you were young, will tell you when you did something wrong. What if everyone did that, right? She would tell you, ask you that. So you can envision the society in which people did what you did. In envisioning the society, you would see, the consequences of your actions. You will see the kind of society that will come about. And the thought is you will be able to use your reason to grasp and comprehend what the right course of action is on the basis of construing it as a law that governs society. And that's the basic claim here. So let's define a maxim a bit more carefully, though. A maxim is something like the principle upon which you're acting or the policy upon which you're acting. Those are accurate descriptions. Here is my preferred description, though. I think this is easier to comprehend and it gives you a more precise account of what a maxim is. A maxim is a description of an action with the intention built into it. So it's a description of what you're doing, the action, but also the motivation or reasons for you doing it. And here's one of my examples. I give a burger, that's the action, handing a burger to a homeless. And then there's the description of the motivation or the intention to satiate the hunger of the homeless. So I can do the same action, hand the burger, for all sorts of reasons, right? I can do it because there's this person that I have a crush on and the person is watching from the other side of the street. And I know that the person likes good people. So, hey, if I give a burger to a homeless, the person might think, hey, Juan is, he's a good person. And they might, accept my asking them on a date or something, right? So I can do the action for very different reasons, right? I can do it for a campaign for political office. I can do it for all sorts of reasons. Or I can do it to satiate the hunger of the homeless for the sake of the well-being of the homeless. And arguably that's the good intention, right? That's the right intention. So maxims have the intentions built into them. And Kant thinks every time you assess an action, you cannot just assess the action. That's not the thing that should be assessed, just handing the burger to homeless. We don't know enough to know whether that's good or bad. We must know what intention is behind the action. And let's just lump that together and call it the maxim. Is the action with the principle or policy or intention behind it. And that's where we assess the action with the motivation for it. And arguably, my giving a burger to a homeless for the sake of impressing someone else by pretending to be who I'm not, because I wouldn't do it otherwise, it's not great. And arguably, doing it for the sake of satiating the hunger of the homeless is good, right? So it is that description, doing it for the sake of satiating the hunger. And if that is my true intention, that's the right action. So it is by assessing maxims that we identify the right course of action. But the categorical imperative says, oh, here's a test. Here's a way of going about testing whether the maxim is the right one. And if it is a maxim that universalizes, in other words, there's a society made up, thought out, you just think about it. A society in which everyone acts that way. Everyone acts on the maxim. Again, not that everyone just does that. It's not just the action of handing the burgers, but with the right intention, with the intention that is built into the maxim. So if there is a society in which everyone does the same action for the same reason, right, the same intention built into it, uh, and things work out well, then that's a good action. If things fall apart in the society, if the society is somehow unthinkable or incoherent or a bad society because everyone does that, then it's a bad society and therefore a bad maxim and therefore a bad action, and you shouldn't do it. And the example that Kant provides that illustrates his account very well is that of making a promise. Suppose you have a friend and then you need some money and then you need $500. So you approach them and say, hey, can I borrow $500? I'll promise to give him back within a month or something. But that's what you say, right? You make a promise. That's the action. But your intention is to break it because you're not going to pay them back. So your maxim is asking for money, making the promise to pay it back with the intention of not doing so, with the intention of breaking the promise. Now, if you imagine a society in which everyone did that, and crucially, the everyone did that is not make promises, because that's fine, but make promises with the intention of breaking them. That's the maxim. What would happen? Here's what Kant tells you. Well, the whole practice of promise making will fall apart, right? If you live in a society in which you know that people make promises with the intention of breaking them, then you wouldn't accept their promises. You think like, no, like I know you're lying, that everyone does it. So when you go to your friend and you say, hey, can I borrow $500? I'll pay you in a month. In a society in which people act on the maxim of making promises with the intention of breaking them, your friend is not going to give you the money, right? He knows you're not going to give it back. The whole practice of promise making falls apart. And what Kant says is that action with the maxim is not universalizable. The society in which everyone does that falls apart in some way. Is the action does not survive the test of a society in which everyone does it. And that is a sign, that's a mark of its being immoral. So morality grounds and creates good society. That's what morality is. So that your maxim is not universalizable, there is no society in which everyone can do that, means that your action is wrong. So in the real world, you shouldn't do it. Why? Because the real world, that the action that you're doing with the intention that you have is one that it's not universalizable. Therefore, it's immoral. And that's what the categorical command says. There's a second formulation of the categorical imperative, categorical command. And according to Kant, it's the same one, but it looks very different. Let's look at this one. And it says, people call it the formula of an end in itself. It says, act in such a way that you always treat humanity, human persons, whether in your own person or in the person of anyone else, never simply as means, but always at the same time as an end. Again, Kantian vocabulary, it looks abstract, it looks difficult to grasp. The basic idea is do not use people. And at the heart of the do not use people is that what it is to treat people morally is to respect or even promote their freedom and autonomy. So the fundamental way of respecting people, people's autonomy and freedom, is by not using them, says Kant, not treating them as mere means, not using them, but rather treating them as ends. What does that mean? Well, here's the basic idea. To treat someone as mere means, to use them, is to involve them in a scheme of action to which they could not in principle consent. And the in principle part matters here. It's not actual consent that matters. It's in consent with full knowledge and full rationality of the person who would have been consenting in this ideal sense. So that you agree to something, you consent to an activity, is not yet enough to know that the activity is moral. You must also know, you must also consent with full knowledge and full rationality of the situation. Here's a story that illustrates this. So a colleague, someone that I know, she met someone during college years and they fell in love, they started dating, they really like each other. And she's female, she's a woman, and the person that she was dating was a man, and the man proposed. He wanted to be married at the end of their undergraduate career, and she was very happy. They seemed to be in love, so she accepted. But she said, "Hey, I really want children. I want to form a family. It would be great if shortly after we get married, we start having children. I really think that happiness, my happiness, requires a family and children, and sooner is better." And the guy, the man thought, well, we're kind of young. And he told her, he kind of convinced her that they both wanted to go to graduate school and that they should wait until they finish graduate school. And that was the original arrangement. She said, okay, let's get married, but I want to have children quickly. And he replied, well, let's wait until after graduate school. And then she said, okay, well, that's still only a few years. We're still young enough. That's fine. So they got married after graduate work. They went to graduate school. They finished graduate school. And then she said, okay, great, great. Several years have passed by. Let's have children now. But now he said, well, we just graduated. We need to find jobs. And having children with no jobs seems like too quick. Why don't we look for some good jobs? She said, okay, fair enough. Let's do this. So they moved on. They tried to find good jobs. Several years went by. They finally found very good jobs at the same university. They were university professors. And at that point, she said again, okay, wonderful, great. We have the cool jobs, the good university. Let's have children. The years keep going by. And now he said, well, we just started the job. There are all of these conditions we must do to succeed in the job. Why don't we give it a few years so that we make sure that we are, we're succeeding, we're doing well, that, we're going to be, that we're going to advance in our careers, and then we'll do it. And by this point, she thought, I don't like this game. I don't think this is going to work. And she asked for divorce. But I tell you this story to illustrate something. Here's what she thinks, my colleague thinks, happened. When she agreed to get married, she thought that the maxim, the scheme of action that they were undertaking, the collective action that they were doing, getting married, was one in which children will be forthcoming soon. And that's what she consented to. She actually consented to the marriage. But she thought that the agreement, the scheme of action, was one of, let's get married, and within a relatively short time, we'll have children. What he actually consented to, she thinks, and let's suppose she's correct, was, let's get married, let's get together, and I, the guy, will try to convince you that we don't need children. We'll try to prolong as much as I can having children, and hopefully we'll just not have children, you'll be happy with it. That's what he was agreeing to. That's what he consented to. They both involved the action of getting married, but the intentions were very different. And my friend, my colleague Frank, she feels betrayed. She feels like she was used. And she was used precisely because she consented to something, but what she consented to was not what she thought she was consenting to. She was used, Kant would say, because the scheme of action, the thing that she was undergoing, was not fully displayed for her. The maxim of the other person with whom she was interacting was not transparent to her. She thought it was a different maxim. And because of that, she was deceived into doing something that she would not have consented had she known better. So what it is to treat someone well and as not use them, not as mere means, is not just to get them to consent to the action, is to get them to consent with full knowledge and full rationality. That is the accurate description of the maxim. What Kant would have suggested to the guy, the man in my story, is to day one, what he proposed, say, here is my maxim. I prefer not to have children. I want you. I want a relationship with you. And I will try to prolong the not having children. I don't know at this point what's going to happen. I don't know if I'll change my mind. I don't know if you will change your mind. But my intentions going into this marriage are to prolong as much as I can not having children. And then she would know exactly what she was getting into, and then she could agree or not agree. And then the interaction between them would have been moral, because it would be the right kind of consent with full knowledge and rationality, not actual consent to something slightly different. So according to Kant, and arguably correct, coercion and deception are the two standard ways. That's so two of the main ways for using someone, for undermining legitimate consent. And the story I told you arguably is a kind of deception. It's a nuanced deception. The action was the same, getting married, but the intentions behind what the maxim was slightly different. And that was enough to illustrate using as mere means instead of ends in themselves. And enough for the kind of consent in question, not to be the appropriate one to respect the autonomy and freedom of my colleague, of the female in the story. So to act freely, then, this summarize, is to act from duty by treating others and oneself as ends in themselves. That is, not as mean, not using people, but rather respecting and promoting their autonomy, their freedom, by being transparent about the maxims upon which we're acting in such a way that other people can see them, can understand them, and consent to those very maxims with full knowledge and rationality. And that's the foundation for moral interaction with others. Okay, let's stop here. I'll see you next time.